Racism and migration, social justice and climate justice for North and South. I mean, it's a very difficult to kind of boil down what we really wanted to talk to. It's some sort of sensible title, really, because there's so much packed into that in terms of migrants in this country and how they're treated, as well as the kind of global situation in terms of climate change and how global will see itself as kind of leading the way, even though it's the cause of the problem, without kind of due care for the kind of impacts that it's having on countries in the global south. We heard that speech by Izzy this morning in terms of some of those countries, especially the island nations, in terms of some of the island nations, what the catastrophic effects the rising sea levels are having there. Now, I'm not going to bang on myself because you've got three fantastic speakers who are far better than me to talk about these issues. So I'm going to go straight to that, and we'll have plenty of time for feedback and discussion. So first, I'm very pleased to call upon John Sinha, who is our very own campaign against climate change and trade union.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that introduction, Tyrone. As Tyrone points out, there are so many aspects to this discussion, and I'm only going to focus on one part of it, even one small part of it, because I simply wouldn't have the time if we were to discuss the totality of the whole question of racism, climate change, and climate crisis. So the thing I want to focus on is the whole question of, a phrase that's been coined, the question of climate refugees. And who are they? Do they really exist? All those kind of questions. Now, the truth about migration is people migrate for all sorts of reasons. And you can't simply pin down on a person, you are a climate refugee. It doesn't work that way. It's a very complex discussion. But for me, the question of climate refugee isn't so much about do they actually exist. I mean, even in international legal terms, there's no such thing as a climate refugee. UN Refugee Convention doesn't mention climate. We do know, I mean, and this is something where we can talk about more concretely, is displaced persons. So people are being displaced because of climate catastrophes. And especially in the global south, there are huge displacements. There are internal displacements, and people moving also. If they are moving, and rarely are they crossing borders, but sometimes they do. The most displacements across international boundaries would be in the global south. So the climate catastrophes disproportionately in affecting the global south. They're the people least responsible and the ones who are suffering most from it. Why? Because of poverty. Also because of lack of infrastructure, things like all the infrastructure we take for granted that was built up, the sewage system, which is now collapsing because of privatisation. That's another story, which we can discuss for another day. But all this infrastructure and the standard of living that we have in the West today was built on 2 centuries of burning fossil fuels. That's how Britain industrialised. And that industrialisation created the wealth to build, cities like London, to build the underground system, to build Britain's railways, all that infrastructure we all take for granted. That was all built on exploitation of fossil fuel, exploitation of labour, exploitation of immigrant labour. We talk about we talk about the Windrush generation that built the NHS and man and woman London transport after all. All that is something we all benefit from and live from. And in the global south, they don't have that infrastructure. So when things happen, when there's a flood or something like that, it's much, much worse. The consequences are much, much serious. The risk of getting typhoid and cholera and all those things are much, much worse. And we also talk within the climate justice, the question of environmental racism, which is something which it was a term coined in the United States, but it's applicable to Britain. It's very interesting how the term environmental racism arose. In the 60s, they had a thing in the States called redlining, where whole districts, blacks couldn't buy property in the nice parts of town. Where did they buy the property? In the industrial areas, in the polluted areas, that's where the whites wouldn't live. In the areas that were going to be torn down to build, urban ring roads, that's where the black community was housed. And that's where the concept of environmental racism came from. We have that in Britain today. If you look at who lives on the North Circular Road, it's not middle class people. People of colour live in the most polluted streets in London. It's no accident that Britain's leading air quality campaigner is a black woman whose daughter, you've heard of Kissy Deborah. Her daughter died from asthma. She was killed by asthma. The asthma was caused by air pollution caused by the South Circular Road. And there are other connections. For instance, who are the biggest climate deniers? Think of people like Suella Braverman. They're also, and Priti Patel. They're also the biggest persecutors of refugees. And this is not a coincidence. This is ideological. There's an ideological connection between climate denialism and racism. What is that connection? It's a fact that these people believe in a hierarchy, that there are peoples whose lives are worth more than others. So the lives of rich white people count more than the lives of poor black people. And that's why they are prepared to sacrifice the lives of the lives of black people to make their profits. They will, that's how nasty and evil these people are. They will sacrifice our lives. We also saw this with COVID, by the way. All the restrictions were costing too much money. Who were the people dying disproportionately from COVID? It was working class people, people of colour in areas such as Tower Hamlets, which suffers terrible air pollution. So, there's all these connections that I could make. And on the question of, the main obsession of this government at the moment seems to be stopping, poor, desperate people crossing the English Channel on very dangerous boats. Why don't they give them, safe passage? And the thing about the slogan that I put with that banner, solidarity with climate refugees, is not privileging one group of refugees over another. It's to say, let's bring the discourse of climate justice into the whole debate about refugees, and actually use that as another front to launch an attack on this racist, appalling government, and actually to build a more united movement, making the black community understand that climate activists, because they haven't been very good at it in the past, but I think things are changing. Build that alliance between climate justice movement, climate activists, and the black community, because we should be all on the same side, fighting this, these people who rule us, who are class enemies, they're enemies of our race. We need to unite and defeat them, and this is a way of building that mass movement.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. I couldn't agree more. I think you probably, I'm not going to say anything, but I think you probably prompted a lot of questions that people will have in their minds and will bring up in the discussion. So, next I'm going to go on to Tyrone. Tyrone Scott, I'm thrilled he's been able to be here because he's the most in-demand person of the day, without doubt. He is a senior movement building and activism officer, Global Green New Deal, for War on Want. So I had to write that down to remember it.
A bit of a mouthful for a job title, to be honest.
Essentially, though, he works for War on Want, which is the important part, and I think we've all got we all know what great work War on Want does. Yeah. So Tyrone, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone. I won't be as skilled as John without any notes, so I'm probably going to be looking quite extensively as my notes down here, but hopefully it just means I won't go off in tangents, which I'm quite susceptible to doing. But yeah, I work for War on Want, and if you don't know War on Want, we work in the UK and with partners across the world to fight against the root causes of poverty, injustice, and defend human rights as sort of part of the movement for global justice. And really happy to be here today, and thanks for inviting me along, because we currently facing multiple crises, unprecedented rise in temperatures, a global crisis of inequality and fueled by corporate greed, and more recently this cost of living crisis, which is again fueled by corporate greed, all of which are sort of ravaging the lives and lands of the world's poorest and most marginalised communities. And these last few years have seen climate breakdown wreak havoc across the globe, whether it's the sort of big flooding displacing 33 million people and submerging a third of Pakistan, to the wildfires that have covered so much of Europe and the rest of the world, to the 55 million people who've been pushed into poverty and climate-induced famine in the Horn of Africa. The effects of the climate crisis are evidently affecting us all, but it's, as you said, now it's those least responsible for causing this crisis who have to deal with pay the heaviest price. And the climate crisis is not just an injustice within itself, in that those who are most impacted and are losing their lives and livelihoods are the ones who've done the least to cause it, but it sort of amplifies every other existing inequality which is baked into a system which sacrifices the poor, those who are black, brown and indigenous, and it denies so many, especially in the global south, denies the most fundamental of rights, which is the right to live free and with dignity. Carry on my notes, but as the climate crisis continues to worsen, the impact on marginalised communities becomes more and more severe, which then means more and more people are being forced to leave their homes. We recently held an online sort of public event, and one of our comrades that we worked with, Mitzi from the Philippines, spoke around how sort of the extreme weather events there are destroying communities in the Philippines and forcing people to leave their home, which is just one microcosm example of what's happening all over the global south. And at the same time, the Philippines and other countries aren't able to adapt to these disasters because of the legacies of colonialism and extractive capitalism, exploitation by rich nations and corporations, meaning that the infrastructure and the economy cannot protect the lives and livelihoods of their people from the crisis that those rich global north countries have caused. So those, whether it's Philippines or anywhere else that are looking to leave, which again is actually much less than what they say the narratives around it. Most people migrate within borders actually, and it's very very rare that migrating across borders are much smaller amounts. But those who do look to look for a safer life, they're often met by, or generally always met by, racist and violent border policies from the global north, and these policies are designed to protect the resources of the global north while giving cheap labour for us to continue exploiting from the global south. And the exploitation of people and planet for profit are two sides of the same coin. It's extractive capitalism that will drain every last drop of oil and wreck the earth for the benefit